So I do apologize. I thought I was going to be able to get through that whole slide, and I just was not. So the rise of nativism, where I kind of left off again, these Americans who are challenging foreign involvement into their country, the argument that immigrants are willing to work for less, and the immigrants are working in the dangerous conditions that Americans were not willing to. So what we see is these secret organizations that will develop. So the Supreme Order of the Star Spangled Banner, again, is one of those initial movements that is supposed to be a secret association. People are not supposed to be aware of um, who is involved in that. The Native American Party, or the Know Nothing movement, is really going to hit its height more so in the 1850s. So again, I mentioned earlier that some of this stuff is going to be outside of that realm, but really anti-Catholic, xenophobic. It started initially as a secret society, but then kind of becomes this major political party. They were supposed to, if they were questioned, this is where the term comes from. If they were questioned, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing." So, like if they were asked about specific discussions of their party. So, the secret part of that goes in with that Order of the Star Spangled Banner. So they are going to be Protestants, and again, kind of challenging Catholics as being deemed as barbaric individuals. So this slide has two different kind of components to it, the rise of unions and then the rise of professions, so the increase there. So unions are going to form as a response to the industrial era and kind of the conflict that emerged there. Artisans who were typically skilled workers in moving into the industrial era are no longer going to be providing those skills, or those skills are no longer necessary because of the factory system, and that's going to allow these goods to be cheaper. And so what you start seeing is more individuals working in this factory-based system, but being frustrated with the amount of hours they have to work each day, their pay, the conditions of the work environment. And so what we see is trade associations that will initially develop to try and protect those interests of the American workers. So, for example, one of the big issues was decreasing the workday just to 10 hours. And what we also see is that initially the federal government is going to be supportive of unions. What is important here, though, is noting that they say peaceful unions. So what we will also see is that individuals are going to become a little more aggressive in their tactics. And so what we will see there is that the government's not necessarily in support. So this is something that kind of there is a continuity in unions existing, but then there's also kind of challenges to those unions as history kind of goes on. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Commonwealth versus Hunt again says that peaceful unions can negotiate labor contracts. Now, whether or not those contracts are successful is kind of up to the individuals involved in it. We see the rise of professions or services in the United States. So as we've kind of shifted to commercial agriculture, as we've shifted to this factory system, we do have this increased revenue where you also have individuals that are making more money. And so we see the rise of retail stores to have better access. We see the rise of printing shops. And then we've also talked about the rise of postal services. In the North or in the East, we're also going to see the introduction of mandatory public education. And we'll get into this when we talk about the reform movements, but this is a kind of direct response to the child labor that had been going on and the conditions that had been occurring there. So this push for children to attend public education at the elementary level, kind of moving forward there. We do see the rise of actual medical practices, so not just having a random physician in an area, but actually trying to educate and increase the medical profession as well as the law profession as well. So one of the images there is Elizabeth Blackwell, who was one of the first to graduate from a medical school. And she kind of graduated at the top of her class and kind of challenges this notion of where women should be. We do see that women become involved in nursing, but one of the things I need you all to understand with this as well is that there still is this concept of the cult of domesticity, that women are still expected to stay at home if you are a wealthy class. So yes, women may become involved in nursing. Your initial teachers were actually men, and then they would move into like your attorney or your law school. And so what we see as well is that women will eventually start kind of replacing them in that field. But this is not your upper class women. You have to understand that their expectation is to remain at home and to not be involved in that public life or any type of politics as well. So then we have foreign treaties or developments that are going to occur. So the Rush Bagot, I always say Bagot. I have heard other people say Bagot. I'm going to say Bagot, but is a agreement with the United States and Great Britain. So the conclusion of the American Revolution, we'd actually seen kind of this conflict that emerged over increasing arms in the Great Lakes region. So this is kind of considered the first arms race. So in the 1790s, the American government had really kind of asked the British to step off, to not increase how many warships they had in the region, to try and push for disarmament. And the British actually ended up increasing um, the amount that they had in the region. And so eventually what we see in 1817 is the Rush-Bagot Agreement that will actually limit the Navy in the Great Lakes. So there, the U.S. and Britain are both only allowed like 1 to 2 warships in each lake. So it is going to show that dismantling kind of the arms in the region. Not, I mean, it's still going to be present, but it's much less. There's going to be an increase in fishing rights, and then the joint occupation of the Oregon Territory along the 49th parallel. So if you look up here, so this is what the treaty is kind of talking about here. So this was the Convention of 1818, kind of that resulted from that. So this is where the 49th parallel will be, to, again, kind of reestablish where the United States borders will potentially be. The Adams-Onís Treaty is going to be with Spain. So this actually kind of resulted from Andrew Jackson. He was asked to kind of deal with the alliances or the tensions between the Seminole Nation and Spain, kind of allying together. So he goes in, and there's kind of this like brutal attack. This really kind of represents Jackson as an individual, where he's actually does more than what he's supposed to, leads these various raids, actually kills like 2 British officers in the region. And John Quincy Adams, who Jackson is later going to question, is actually one of the individuals who says to not reprimand him too much. And so Jackson kind of leads these raids. And this leads into the Spanish government dealing with its own problems, because at this moment in time, the Spanish colonies were pushing for their independence, and many of them, obviously, they were successful. And so this is going to kind of lead into this agreement between Spain and the U.S., where they gain Florida. And you can see on the map there the area ceded here. And then Spain will also give up any of its territorial rights in the Oregon country. So then it will just kind of be the U.S. and Great Britain in that region. The Monroe Doctrine is one of the more significant doctrines that's not really put to use or enforced for years. But the Monroe Doctrine is going to be established to respond to foreign threats. And ultimately, the fear is that, France had lost its territory in the Western Hemisphere. Spain was losing its territory. At this point, like Russia has Alaska. But the fear is that like Tsar Alexander was going to extend his position, and because he was, as far as Europe was concerned, trying to expand its borders. And so there was kind of this fear that he was also going to attempt to do that. So what we'd initially seen was this attempt to align with Britain to claim that the Western Hemisphere was off limits. But what we do see is that there was a fear, like that Britain was going to just try and imperialize the region itself. So Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine that says, the Western Hemisphere is off limits for further colonization. And the one thing, it does frustrate European powers, but the one thing I guess that works in Monroe's favor is that nobody tested, because had somebody potentially tested it, the U.S. probably would not have done very much. The British actually did kind of engage in further colonization in the region, and the U.S. didn't respond. But it will get put to use later, and you will see that the federal government is willing to kind of use force to protect the Western Hemisphere, really just to protect American interests, but that comes a little bit later. So we also see the concerns over slavery as kind of the rise of slavery from the cotton gin and it being associated as this peculiar institution. This leads to further sectionalism or debates between those that support abolitionism and those that are supporting slavery. And what we initially see, or what we start seeing, is this transition to justifying slavery on religious grounds and moral grounds. Overall. So we'll get into that discussion much later because it's a very complex discussion. But what we do start seeing is that slaves are willing to kind of challenge their place in society. And so we've talked about this before, where they may sabotage their work, they may slow down, they may break tools, they may attempt to escape. And then you have 2 big rebellions that are going to occur. So Vesey Rebellion is going to occur in 1822. He was actually illiterate. He had been a former slave. And so he was in South Carolina, and it was this rebellion, or the argument was, is that he was plotting or planning to like get all the slaves in the region to revolt, and then they were going to flee to Haiti, which again had gained its independence. They had their first constitution in 1804, and so he is actually going to be caught and executed by hanging. Nat Turner's rebellion is one that has actually received a lot of attention recently. I think there's been several movies made about it because of the lasting impact that it had. So he was a slave that led, or a preacher that had led this kind of 2-day revolt that resulted in the deaths of, I think, about 60 white individuals, and it included children in that. And so the retaliation is that we see these white mobs that kind of organize and just go kill blacks living in the area. And it didn't matter if they were a part of the revolt or not. They killed over 100 people. And again, didn't care if they had ties to the revolt. And so he had actually gone into hiding. But eventually Nat Turner is found, and then he's executed by hanging as well. Although there are some that argue that there were further attacks on his body as well. But what we see as far as the lasting impact of Nat Turner's rebellion is that it increases slave codes, it increases these discriminatory laws. They lose the right to vote in some regions. They're not allowed to receive an education. Some like even kind of challenge church attendance because, again, he was a preacher. So really led into increased discrimination and hostility towards the Black population by slave owners and white individuals in general. All right, so that is the end. Sorry it took 3 videos, but hopefully it helped to cover all that content.